Hey everyone, welcome to the Cyclonic Thrift Podcast, the series focusing on deck building, card analysis, and financial speculation, all through the eyes of a commander player on a budget. I'm your host Zach, joined as always by
Christian. Hey, everybody.
Hey, so today we're going to be going over the second episode of our mini-series, the analysis of a budget environment. So we're going to be talking about the deck and deck components, what kind of cards you should be running in your deck, and why, and kind of the different deck makeup. If you didn't watch our previous episode on Commanders, we suggest you go back and watch that before this one. So, Christian, if you want to get us started on the first deck component.
Yep, sounds good. So, one of the first components to go on a deck, and we're gonna go. We've kind of broken everything down to different categories to make it simple. These categories can change from deck to deck, of course, and it varies. But on paper, this is a very straightforward, simple organization of what makes a deck a commander deck. So, the first one we have here is the value section. And the value section, we kind of talked about a little bit in the first episode. It is kind of the game plan, the meat of the game plan, I'd say, right, Zach? It kind of is the good stuff that works with your commander.
Yeah, so
So,
like your engines and things like that. Okay.
exactly. So, this would be the gas of the deck that people would say. Like I said, Zach and I use the term gas, other players use it as gas. This is the gas of the deck. It's all usually based around your commander's ability. It abuses that ability really well. These cards are abused by that ability very well. Um, and all these cards are used to get ahead of your opponents and try to last or reach your game plan.
Yeah, so a card being considered value heavy in the commander deck is anything that's really powerful and could be usable in probably multiple decks or is really abusable, like Christian said, by your commander's ability. Typically, most decks are going to run about 18 to 32 cards in this range. And sometimes these cards are going to be cards that you might include even if they're outside of your typical budget, like 40 cents for a card. You might end up spending a couple dollars on a card if it's just good enough to go into the deck and is abusable enough by your commander that you think it's really going to help you win the game. So I'll jump into some examples of value cards. Uh, One card that we would consider value card is like Meteor Golem in certain decks, so I'll go ahead and read that. Meteor Golem is 7 generic mana for artifact creature golem. It's a 3/3, and when Meteor Golem enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls. So this card is very good in, say, like a bounce deck, like a Brago King Eternal, where you can obviously get multiple triggers off of the enter the battlefield effect by bouncing it, or say a Yarok deck, where again you get multiple triggers off of this creature entering, so you could destroy up to 2 target non-land permanents.
Yeah, exactly. So, one card in a deck may not be value in another deck. Meteor Golem is a great example of that. This card is insane in a Brago deck. It's great in a Yarok deck because it'll trigger twice. Any type of deck that cares about flickering and bouncing over and over, it's going to matter. But a deck that doesn't do that, Meteor Golem is probably not going to get included. So that's another element of value to make sure that it makes sense in the deck that it's in. Another example is Viscera Seer. It's a sacrifice outlet. Viscera Seer says sacrifice a creature, scry 1, and it's a 1/1 vampire wizard creature for 1 black. And this card you can use in a Marin deck, a pretty much any graveyard deck, really. Varl's the scavenger, I believe his name is, to get things in the yard. Um, and any commander that cares about sacrifice, a Viscera Seer should be in there because it's going to abuse your commander's ability. It's going to make use of it. Like I said, in a Marin deck, it's going to fill the yard while also gaining experience counters for her. So again, in a red white black deck, or 3-color deck, something like that, where it doesn't care about his graveyard as much, probably you're probably not going to use Viscera Seer. But in a Sultai deck, like Sidisi, Viscera Seer plays a really strong role in that deck. It is pure value because it's getting sacrifice triggers, it's filling your yard, and it's helping you scry, and it's only 1 mana. So that's another example of a strong value card.
Yep. And another card we're going to go over is Astral Slide. So that is 2 and a white for an enchantment. And whenever a player cycles a card, you may exile target creature. If you do, return the exiled creature card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So obviously this is very strong with any deck that cares about cycling or even just like cycling sub theme where you're bouncing a lot of creatures. This will help you, get additional triggers off of your creatures. Maybe if you're running ETB creatures, or if you want to say exile one of your opponent's creatures to deny them some value until the end of their end step. And this can all be done at instant speed, so it can be very powerful and have a lot of options.
Yeah. Um, Another good example. So all these cards you can tell they're just really powerful in the decks that they go in. They get you ahead, they help you stay ahead, but notice they don't really help you close out a game. Meteor Golem's never going to help you kill somebody. This Receiver's never going to do that. Astral Slide's never going to do that. None of these cards actually kill anybody. And that's why we put them in the value section, because they just help you do well. They help make use of your commander's ability. Now, before we move on to the next category, I want to look at the number of cards and the budget section of it a bit more, because obviously we said 18 to 32 cards. That's kind of a big range, but it's because you'll see in some of these categories, cards can fill two roles, if you will. So Meteor Golem enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent. That is a value card because it's abusable, but it's also a removal card, so it'll show up in our control category later. Not Meteor Golem specifically, but it would show up in a deck's control category because it removes things. So that's why we put that 18 to 13, 18 to 32 card range, because some cards fill two roles at once. Sometimes a card that helps you ramp may also be a value card, like in a Wart deck, you can copy it. So it really varies. But overall, that's a good range, especially if your commander's ability doesn't necessarily associate with removal or ramp or something like that. Um, I don't know if you want to go into more detail about the budget section, Zach. Just to clarify, you talked about $1, but how often does that happen?
Yeah, so as far as the budget, I mean, it really depends on the deck. Like, Viscera Seer is actually I don't know how much Viscera Seer this is, but something like Viscera Seer, if I were building, say, a Corvold deck or like Christian any deck that really cares about sacrificing creatures, I would pay, $1.50 or whatever for Viscera Seer just because sack outlets, especially anything cheaper like Viscera Seer, I think is, are really central to the deck and hard to find in a budget scenario because things like, say, Birthing Pod or Ashnod's Altar or anything like that are going to be hard to fit
Yeah,
in a budget. And
yeah,
actually,
Ashnod's
Ashnod's
also a good
Altar is
example.
probably a better example. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a good example because a good um scenario of that's my Grenzo deck. That deck is a combo deck, and it's pretty well tuned. The whole deck is just trying to get out a ton of different pieces that could work, that are really interchangeable. But Ashnod's Ultra is one of those cards that I was like, man, I have to include this. I just have to. And it was like $3 or $4 at the time, and that's not too bad. But it's enough that I have to dedicate. I mean, that's a large percentage of your budget in $5 to include it. But it's, again, like Zach said, sometimes you just say, you know what, I have to run this card, and you just do it. And with value, a card that's $1 here, another dollar there, 60, 70 cents here. It's not too bad, but obviously you can't do that for every single value card because you're going to run out of budget really fast, and your rest of your deck's going to suffer. But every couple budget cards, if it just really does the job, like Zach said with Viscera Seer, it's the ultimate sack outlet in Commander. You just take the hit on the nose if it's like $1, and you just go with it because it's just that good.
Yep. I agree. So I think we're going to jump into the finisher section next. So finishers are your win conditions. This could be combo pieces, a pump spell, any kind of alternate win con, like a drain effect, a burn spell, anything like that. Essentially anything that you could use to win the game. So typically a finisher is something that's going to be abusable by your commander's ability, kind of like the value cards that we talked about. A lot of these are going to be dependent on board state, depending on the type of commander you have. Like say, if you're running a Zest deck, obviously you have a lot of different options, most likely for finishers, because it is a combat based deck, kind of battle cruisery. And whereas if you're maybe running like a Yarok deck or something like that, or some kind of combo deck, usually you're gonna have less cards that are really finishers. You have combo cards like a Deadeye or something like that, and maybe an alternate win con like a combat like Avengers Zendikar or something along those lines.
Right. Um, when it comes to finishers in the amount in the deck, usually 6 to 8 is fine because we'll get into why 6 to 8 is a good spot in a second. But 6 to 8 cards generally in the deck is where you want to be. This is another area where you could reasonably spend a good chunk of your budget. Again, it's only 6 to 8 cards, so you don't want to go crazy. But like Zach said, when he was building his old Yarok deck, when Deadeye was totally well, I say totally within budget, but it was still outside the average by a lot. Is one of those cards that he says, this actually wins the game for me. I have to accept the, whatever it was, $5, $6 price tag at the time and just go with it because it's so powerful. So again, kind of like value, maybe on less of a quantity space because 18 to 32 cards is much different than 6 to 8. So one of these 6 to 8 cards or two of these 6 to 8 cards might cost $4 to $6, and that's fine because it just wins you the game. So jumping into examples, first one we have here is Comet Storm. X red for an instant, and it has multi-kicker, which if you don't know multi-kicker, it has multi-kicker 1, and it says you may pay an additional 1 generic mana any number of times as you cast this spell. And then it says choose any target, then choose another target for each time you paid the kicker cost. Comet Storm deals X damage to each target. So basically, this card is going to be a kill spell in any kind of burn scenario. For me, I use this card in Wart because I can cast it. My entire point is to just all game. My whole game plan is just getting out tons of mana effects, tons of lands. Been copying Ramping Earth, been copying Cultivates, Explosive Vegetations. I need to have 30 land out. I make all my creatures with into mana dorks, so something like Cryptolith Right. All of this is just to build up a ton of mana, and with that mana, I dump all of it into Comet Storm, and then I can copy it. With the multi-kicker, copies automatically, so I would multi-kick it twice to target 2 additional opponents, and then with Wart, I'm copying the spell, so I'm targeting every opponent twice. So that, as long as I'm casting it for 20, that'll kill all my opponents. And that's why it's a finisher, because if I were to cast this card on turn 5, what's it doing for me? Yeah, I can copy it Wart, and yeah, it's good, but it doesn't really do anything. So that's why it's a finisher, because at the end of the game, you finish off your opponents when you can get the maximum value out of this card, and it wins. It finishes them, and that's why it's a finisher and a good example for it, at least in a burn deck or a spell slinger kind of copy deck.
Yep. So another example that we have of a different kind of finisher. In this case, we're going to be talking about a pump spell. Uh, so this is Overwhelming Stampede. This is 3 green for a sorcery. It says until end of turn, creatures you control gain trample and get +X+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So obviously this is really board state dependent, kind of like Kristen was talking about with Comet Storm, but in a different way. So this is going to depend on the creatures you have out. So let's say you have maybe a bunch of token creatures, 1/1s, something like that, and then your commander or some other higher powered creature. This would really help you finish out the game because you're going to be giving all of those creatures +X+X based on that one creature you have that's already bigger. Say you have like a 7/7 or something like that, then you're going to have all your tokens will essentially be 8/8s after you cast a spell, and they're going to gain trample, so you don't have to worry as much about getting chump blocked or anything like that. You're going to be able to trample over for a lot of extra damage. So yeah, like we said, this is pretty board state dependent, but it's definitely going to help you kind of go the extra mile if you're just having trouble getting through damage with all your smaller tokens.
Yep, exactly. And another final example we have, again, we've kind of hit each, some different archetypes with a burn spell and then a combat based finisher. This is a combo based finisher, and this is Laboratory Maniac, a classic if you've played a lot of Commander. For 2 and a blue for a 2/2 creature human wizard. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead of losing it. So again, we keep mentioning this is board state dependent. It, all these finishers are dependent on your game plan or your value cards. You're trying to get to a point where you feel safe and can make use of these finishers. They're not going to win the game for you, on turn two. So Laboratory Maniac is a great example of that because you can see it in any kind of deck that has infinite self mill or infinite draw. You would essentially set up whatever your combo is to draw all the cards from your deck or draw or produce infinite mana that allows you to draw all the cards from your deck. Anything like that. Once you have that set up, you do it until you have a card left or no cards left, and then you cast Laboratory Maniac and you use your last draw spell, whatever it may be. Maybe you cast an Opt or a Brainstorm or something like that, and you win the game because you drew from an empty library. So this is a very different scenario from Overwhelming Stampede and Comet Storm, where it's a combo based finisher. You have done something infinite or did some way to get you to just go through your entire deck and then just finish the Laboratory Maniac. Obviously doesn't include killing your opponents. This is kind of this one of those alternate win condition type of cards where it says you win the game some other way than just all your opponents is zero.
And we wanted to talk a bit about why we typically run 6 to 8 finishers in a deck, and why you don't really want to oversaturate your deck with things that are gonna help you win the game, or not help you, but actually win you the game. So like we talked about, these cards, a lot of them are really board state dependent, especially stuff like Comet Storm and Overwhelming Stampede that we went over. You know, like we kind of hinted at, you don't want to have a lot of those that are just going to be okay early game or even bad early game, and not uh, you know be just something that you're not going to be able to cast for a long time. Uh, so if you had, say, 12 cards like that, that's over a 10% chance at any given time that you're going to draw a card is just going to be dead until you have the board state to actually win.
Right.
So it's generally would be better to just run fewer of those and run more value things that are maybe going to help you get to that board state where you can cast a finisher.
Yep, exactly. That's a good way to put it. You just don't want all these dead cards in your hand because Overwhelming Stampede on turn three does nothing. It's going to suck to draw that on turn three because you're going to be holding it all game, and there's a chance it could get discarded, or a wheel effect will take it away, and then you're going to have to worry about getting out of your graveyard. It's just not where you want to be. 6 to 8's a good slot, and these 6 to 8 cards, Zach, when we were constructing your Yarak deck for the episode coming up here soon, these 6 to 8 cards could basically be interchangeable, right? You don't need 6 to 8 different win conditions. Half of them could be the same type of Overwhelming Stampede effect where you pump everything. But as long as you have multiple versions of that, that's fine. Doesn't matter what your win condition is, it could be the same thing, but you can have multiple copies, and that's totally reasonable.
Yeah, exactly. So like, it kind of goes into resiliency of a deck. Like Christian saying, if you're gonna run something like Overwhelming Stampede, you probably want to run something else that's similar to Overwhelming Stampede, and that'll be 2 out of your 6 to 8 cards, because this could get discarded from your hand from a wheel or something like that, or it could just get countered, anything like that. So you definitely want to have resiliency in your finishers. Uh, and
True.
then more combo based decks as well. It's like sometimes those are going to be 2 to 3 card combos, so that's going to take up a significant chunk of this. And a lot of times, even with those, there are different pieces you can kind of assemble that'll do the same thing, maybe slightly different combinations of cards that still get you to the same kind of end goal.
Yeah, true. I didn't think about the countering, the counter stuff because that'll come up later, I think, in another category called utility, and that those cards are important for protecting your finishers from counter spells. So we'll jump into that when we get there, but that is an important point to bring up.
So I think we're going to jump into the ramp section next. So ramper cards that typically allow you to go faster and cast things earlier in the game. You know, they're going to get lands out for you, give you extra mana somehow. Uh, and the kind of ramp spells that you're going to be running are really dependent on kind of your colors. Green has a ton of ramp options, much more than any other color in the game, really. Especially outside of artifacts, green has a lot of just instants and sorceries that are going to help you ramp. And usually we run about 8 to 12 ramp cards in the slot, and that is kind of highly dependent on what you want your deck to do, how important it is that you want to go fast with this deck. And budget wise, this could be a decent amount of your budget, especially if you're running a non-green deck that's going to be more dependent on things like signets and talismans
Yeah,
and just artifact ramp in general. That's going to be more expensive.
yeah, for sure. That's a good point because, like Zach said, if you're not in green, you are going to have to run artifacts, and they can get a little bit pricey. Sure, there's some cards that produce mana, but oddly enough, that aren't white or sorry, that aren't green. But oddly enough, most of them that aren't green produce green. So like Avacyn's Pilgrim, I think it's a one drop white card, and I think it is a one drop green card, but it produces white. So it green is going to find its way into a mana dork somewhere in most cases. So you are still kind of stuck in green, even though it's producing white. The creature's green. So you really need to consider your budget in this category if you're not playing green.
Yep. So some examples of ramp cards are Rampant Growth. So this is a pretty classic commander card. Go ahead and read it. It's one in the green for sorcery, and it says search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So obviously, this is going to be castable. Hopefully, if you're hitting your land drops on turn 2, and it's going to go get you another land that you can put onto the battlefield right away. It's going to be tapped, so it's not going to be usable that turn. But next turn, obviously, if you're running, say, a 4-drop commander, this could let you play it a turn early by getting you that extra land. And if you're running 3-color, it's good for color fixing because you can get any basic land type. So if you're running Sultai or something, you only have a black and a blue, or well, actually you'd have to have a green. But if you only have a green and a blue out, say, and you wanted to go get a swamp, this would help you do that and make sure that you'll be able to pay that Sultai when the time comes to cast your commander.
Yep, exactly. Rampant Growth pretty much finds its way into every green deck I'm playing because it's just so straightforward. It's so easy, 2 mana, and you ramp. Like it's just good. This card is where the term ramp comes from. So it is obviously a proven staple in Commander. Another example, if you're not playing green, is it Signet or any of the Signets really? For 2 generic mana, it is an artifact, and it says pay 1 generic and tap it. Add blue red to your mana pool, and obviously any other Signet, it's those colors. So Golgari will add a black and a green. Zorius will add white and a blue. And this card, it's all the signets are also just commander staples. You turn 2, you lay it, and you can immediately make use of it the following turn. If you end up with it in your hand on turn 3, you can actually make use of it that turn. It's a really versatile card. The fact it gives you 2 mana, one of each color, is great. Um, and if you're not playing green, you almost should there's almost no excuse to not run your signets, in all honesty. You need to be running your signets. Even in green, you should run your signets. So that's how important they are.
Yep. And the last example that we have here is that's actually a ramp spell. So this is Knight of the White Orchid. It's white white for creature human knight, has first strike, and when Knight of the White on the battlefield, then shuffle your library to uh, another color besides. screen. Uh, if you play this on turn two
Yeah.
and you went first, maybe nobody has more
Yeah, it
lands than
helps
you
if you're
yet.
going
So
last.
it's, yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and for all you commander players that have been around, and you're probably wondering why we didn't say Soul Ring. We specifically didn't include Soul Ring because it's an obvious card, but second of all, you can't always include it in budget. I think Zach talked about that on a previous episode, how it's just a luxury card in budget because of its consistent $2 to $3 price. And yes, it is fantastic. And there are some decks that, like a Brago deck, because he has two in his cost, you should be running it, but it's not always necessary. And it really hurts just to dedicate $2 to $3 of your budget to that card every single time you build a budget deck.
Yeah, and especially with that kind of sub 10% chance that you're actually going to draw it on turn one or two, where it's going to be the most impactful.
Right,
And
exactly. If you draw it turn 6, you kinda just don't care at that point.
yeah,
So, and for me, I think also use that if you're spending $3 on a card, you want it to be kinda good all the time in most cases.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. When it comes to 8 to 12 slot, again, all of these number of slots is kind of not interchangeable, but free range, but within reason. We thought 8 to 12 was good. Some decks that care about landfall may run more. In my work deck, where my entire goal is to just get more land out, I run a little bit more, especially because I can copy it, so it's extra abusable. But generally, 8 to 12 in your standard deck that's not specifically going to make use of landfall or specifically copying it is probably good. You could go as far as 14, but ramp can really put you ahead in a game or save you. I know there's plenty of times where someone's been in trouble, they've been behind, and then they finally hit, their cultivate or something, and then they're back on the warpath. They can now make a comeback. They're now a presence in the game because if you're sitting there on turn 6 with two lands, A, you're not having a good time, and B, you're not impacting the game, and you just don't want to be there.
Yep, for sure. I think something else that might affect that 8 to 12 number is just the number of colors you're running. So if you run
True.
like 3, 4, 5 colors, you'll probably run more ramp just due to the color fixing, especially in 4 or 5. Just because it's going to be a lot harder to consistently get all these different colored mana to actually be able to do what you're trying to do with your 5 colors.
Yeah, you need your colors, so ramp also does that for you, not just make you go faster.
All right, so I think we're going to jump into the control section next. Uh, So control cards are cards that are generally used to hinder your opponent's game plan, whether it be removal, counter spells, tax effects, really anything that's kind of interaction with your opponent's board state and what they're doing, particularly like instants, like counter spells. Uh, so this can vary pretty heavily depending on what colors you're in. Blue obviously is going to be the most common color, I would say, in control decks, just because blue has the most access to things like counter spells and just countering kind of effects in general. And then like white would probably run more tax type effects, whereas black would probably have more removal. So it's really kind of color dependent. Uh, and control is really kind of vital to keeping your opponents from winning the game. Uh, You know, if you don't have any way to interact with your opponents, it can really kind of turn into, who can play it out the fastest, who draws out the combo pieces the fastest, and things like that. And obviously, that's not always going to be you. So it's great to have some way to stop somebody else from doing it if you can't get to it first.
Yep, exactly. Again, it's really dependent on the decks, but you don't want to be playing at your opponent's pace. You want to play your deck at your pace, and the only way to really do that's with control, either by taking away their pieces or milling them out of useful cards, anything like that. Um, this slot in control, I would say you could reasonably run 10 to 14 control spells. I'm a bit more play my game plan, a bit more synergy card heavy in my deck, so I probably run closer to 8 to 12, 6 to 10 maybe, maybe not that low, but yeah, probably not that low. At least 8 to 10 is my guaranteed. but it just depends what you're doing. If you want to take the risk of not running control, that's on you, but you need to make sure you're running it because these are cards are key for stopping a finisher, a win condition from coming out. If someone starts to play that overwhelming stampede, well, you better hope that you have a counter spell or something like that, or some way to a fog effect, which is more like a utility spell. But anyway, some type of removal or control to just stop whatever's about to happen from happening. Because if you don't, well, you're going to just lose. So these type of cards are actually what can make or break you in terms of losing the game. Not winning the game, but making sure you don't lose. When it comes to the budget of these cards, you have so many options in Magic for control and removal and tax effects. Tax effects are certainly more expensive, like we talked about in our previous episode. So a lot of times they don't make their way into budget decks, but there are some here and there that are affordable. But as for actual removal and control, you have so many options to pick from that your budget should not really be sacrificed here. I can't really think of many cards. I don't know about you, Zach, that are expensive in terms of control and removal, but they're out there. But you're gonna be just fine without wasting the money on them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you count like pillow fort type effects or maybe more stacks type effects, like you said, are going to be more expensive. But generally, your counter spells and your removal are not going to be a huge part of your budget.
Right, exactly.
All right, so we'll jump into some examples here. So the first example we have is Bone Splinters. It's 1 black for a sorcery. It reads as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, and destroy target creature. So this is obviously just a straight up creature removal spell. It's 1 black, which is great, very cheap, and in a lot of cases this is going to play in your game plan. It lets you sacrifice a creature. It just, like I said, straight up removal, pretty straightforward. Very versatile as far as it can remove any creature you want, and it only costs 1 black. So yeah.
Yep. An example of an actual counter spell is counterspell, which is blue blue for an instant, and it says counter target spell. Much like Bone Splinters, it just does what it does. No restrictions. You just counter spell, and the price of this just make sure that you can do it pretty much at any point in the game. A lot of newer counter spells for the same price, but just an extra generic mana on there, so that's what makes counter spell one of the best.
Yeah, and a lot of them are also, well, not a lot, but some like dissolve, say, is counter target instant spell, I think, or non-creature
Negate
spell.
negate is
Negate,
non-creature,
okay,
yeah.
yeah, non-creature. Yeah, so this one obviously you can counter any spell, so it's just better
Yep.
in that aspect anyway. So the last thing we have here for examples is Nature's Claim. It's 1 and a green for an instant. And destroy target artifact or enchantment. Its controller gains 4 life. So this is artifact or enchantment removal. Only costs a green, which is nice. It's also an instant, which is a little bit nicer than sorcery speed because I can, say I have a green that I didn't use throughout my turn and just want to be as efficient as possible with my mana. I can, in Nature's Claim, somebody's artifact or enchantment and just make use of that.
Yeah, and you don't really care about the 4 life in Commander. They're already at 40. What's another 4, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it just doesn't matter. And honestly, the 3 cards that we listed here are pretty premier in our budget format. These cards come up a lot in a lot of people's decks, and I think all of them are below 20 cents, maybe even less than that. Safe counter spells probably at like 50 cents. So these are all excellent removal spells and below your average budget card cost. And that's kind of what we were talking about when we said that there's so many options out there, your budget shouldn't really suffer here.
So we'll jump into the draw section unless you have anything else to add here, Christian.
No, yeah, I think we pretty much covered it. These cards are really important. But at the same time, your budget shouldn't really be affected by them because there's just so many good ones.
Yep. All right. So as far as draw spells, these are typically any spell or effect that's going to help you dig through your deck, get more cards into your hand. and just really help you kind of find the key pieces that you're looking for. So draw is really vital in a commander deck. Obviously, if you're not drawing cards, if you're empty grip throughout the game, you're gonna have a lot less options than somebody who has 5, 6, 7 cards in their hand and say has some counter spells or anything like that that they've drawn and can just interact a lot more with the game and just have an effect on the outcome, obviously. So typically you're gonna run about 8 to 12 draw spells, probably more depending on what
Yeah.
colors you're in and what your overall game plan is. You know, and another thing that maybe goes into this is your commander. Obviously, some commanders are gonna help you to draw cards if that's really your game plan. Like say Tadiova is gonna help you draw cards through playing lands. So there are some, uh, I guess, conditions to that number. But
Yeah, definitely. Um, we have a buddy that would argue that you should run at least 24 draw spells in every deck you build, which that's a bit of exaggeration, but there is truth to that. There's reason to that because like we said, if you don't want to be sitting there with a good board state and no cards in your hand, or just short of your finisher and you can't find it because you can't draw any cards. So 8 to 12 probably is the lower end of the spectrum. I typically run probably at least 12, give or take. And again, Zach said, in all these cases, like we said, the commander is kind of can make it more or less dependent how many of these cards you run. But generally speaking, I usually run about 12 because there's been so many times in the past where I've kind of neglected draw and I've just sat there and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take out 2 or 3 of these cards for draw just to make sure I'm always doing something because that's how you impact a game if you're constantly doing something. When it comes to the budget of these cards, um, it's sort of like Control where there's just so many, and they're always making new ones and better ones that you shouldn't really be sacrificing a ton of budget on these, or you don't have to. And you can still have great draw. There are some that are great that are not necessarily budget, of course, but generally speaking, you can make do with what is in budget. And don't forget that drawing cards doesn't literally have to say draw cards on it. It could be exiling them into a turn, which you see in red a lot, revealing the cards and putting them in your hand. You see in green a good bit, even white, where you look at the top 3 cards and put one into your hand or something like that, or just like we said, just straight draw X number of cards, which you see a lot in blue.
yep. And scrying is another thing I obviously see a lot in blue and other colors too. That I would say is similar enough to a draw effect, just because you're gonna be able to kind of manipulate the top card of your deck and control what you're gonna draw next.
Right, just because you're not putting in your hand, you're at least clearing the way for your next actual draw step to be good.
Yep. So some examples are Secrets of the Golden City. This is 1 blue for sorcery, and it has Ascend. So if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing for the rest of the game. It says draw 2 cards, and if you have the city's blessing, draw 3 cards instead. So a lot of times, if you're a good way into the game, and you say have 6 lands and some artifacts and enchantments and stuff, you're gonna be able to draw 3 cards from this for 3 mana. So I say, generally speaking, if you can have a 1-to-1 ratio of CMC to the number of cards you're drawing, that's really strong. But this is like I said, it's a sorcery, so it's a little bit less versatile than an instant with the same effect, but it is still really strong. It's just going to help you shoot up draw cards, and you get the city's blessing, which probably isn't going to be super impactful, but could affect the game later on, possibly if you have another card that has Ascend or cares about Ascend.
Yeah, it's a divination at worst, and at best you draw 3 cards for 3. Like Zach said, the 1 for 1 is kind of a good way to look at it. Another example is Thrill of Possibility, which is 1 in a red for an instant. As additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card, and then you draw 2 cards. Um, it's an instant, so that's great. Um, But in red, you typically should expect to be discarding to get the benefit of drawing. It's just kind of something that color does. But red in recent time has gotten a little bit better at drawing cards. This card's from Eldraine. I believe that's the first printing of it. There's always been Tormenting Voice, which is similar, but it's a sorcery, so Thrill Possibility is just better. So if you run Tormenting Voice, go ahead and axe it for Thrill Possibility, or just run both because you need to draw cards in red. Um, but red has gotten better. Not at straight up drawing, but they've had these effects where it'll say exile a card, you can cast it into a turn. Well, they've gotten more of those, and it's been updated more so recently to say until your next turn. And I used to not like this effect, but as I said, it's gotten better recently. And there's a card that I found called Ignite the Future for 3 in a red. It's a sorcery. It says exile top 3 cards of your library until your next turn. You may play those cards. If this card was cast from your graveyard, you may cast without paying its mana cost. And has flashback for 7 in a red. I run this in my work deck because I can copy it. So all of a sudden, I'm paying 3 mana, or I'm sorry, 4 mana to draw 6 cards and use them into my next turn. That's pretty good in red, especially when you use the flashback effect. So just because you have to exile them and you have a condition with them, again, nothing's drawing as good as blue or even black. So doing things where you can on a budget, these type of effects in red are great for that.
Yep. And our final example is going to be a green draw spell. Harmonize for 2 green sorcery. It says draw 3 cards. Obviously, this card's very straightforward. It is drawing 3 cards, a little bit like Secrets of the Golden City, but obviously green. Pretty classic draw spell for green.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's straightforward. Harmonize is a classic, and it doesn't hit that 1-for-1 like we talked about, but green, and the only other time you're really not never drawing cards straight up, right, Zach? You usually will say something like draw equal to the power of a creature or draw to the number of creatures. And those are insane spells and they're great, but they rely on a board state heavily. This turn 4, you just slam and draw 3 cards, and that is excellent in green.
Yeah, I mean, this is great if you, like you say, you don't have that board state, don't have anything online like a Soul of the Harvest or Guardian Project or anything like that. That's going to be more dependent on you, having to play things and have things enter the battlefield, stuff like that.
Right, exactly. So those are 3 examples of draw, all of which were pretty straightforward in terms of a draw spell. But like I said, I gave an example of an exiling. Anticipate is ones where you look at the top 3 and pick one. Board the Weatherlight is like that for white. So there's a lot of different ones, and we can't forget things like Ponder. Our buddy would not forgive us. We didn't mention Ponder. He slams it in essentially all of his decks, and there's a budget option of it he uses if he can't afford it. But quick little, they're called cantrips, and it's just quick 1 to 2 blue mana, just basically interchange a couple cards, and they can really keep you churning through your deck because if nothing else, you want to be digging through your deck, and that's kind of what Zach was talking about, which Zach is an expert in digging through your deck and his combo decks of like Yarok. That's all he wants to do all game is just if he's not putting 4 or 5 cards into his hand from his deck in his Yarok deck, he knows he's probably in trouble.
Yeah, and like Kirsten said, just digging, not even necessarily drawing, but kind of being able to filter through and get the cards that are important at the time is just really powerful.
Yep, exactly. So next, we'll move into the utility section of a deck. These cards are very, very important, ensuring you have all you need to win the game and do so safely, or save yourself from losing the game sometimes. Um, Utility cards, they can come in the form of commander protection or any protection for any creature, really. Recursion spells, tutoring. There's so much more that utility is a very, very broad category that we've created here. But a utility card when you see it because it doesn't really draw you cards, doesn't really destroy anything, doesn't really win you the game, but you need them to ensure everything else works. It's almost like a little bit of glue between each part of the deck.
Yeah, and like Kirsten said, this is a super broad kind of category here, but there are, uh, a lot of things that say fall into another category will probably also fall into utility. Uh, but anyway, so generally, a deck should run about 6 to 10 utility cards. And there are a lot of utility cards in Magic, like we've talked about, and just because there are so many different options, it's probably not going to be a huge part of your budget. It really depends on what you're running, since this is such a broad category. Like a lot of, say, protection spells, there's a huge range in price going up from, say, a Swiftfoot Boots, which is like a budget option, up to Lightning Greaves. There's Whisper Silk Cloak, and there's just, that, even just those three cards range from like the 50, 60 cents up to like $7 or $8 now for Lightning
Yeah.
Greaves. And they all kind of have a very similar effect. So,
Mhm.
it really depends on how important that particular card is, whether or not you want to spend that extra money to keep it in your budget.
Yeah, exactly. And 6 to 10, you could do more, all of these again for the third time. It's optional. It's a range. You can go more below. Utility is a section where, kind of like control, if you're willing to just go without it, you could put more value cards on the deck, and you're taking a risk by doing so. I will admit I can go low on the utilities sometimes to have more value because I love pushing my game plan. And sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes my commander is exposed the whole time and it gets removed, and what am I going to do about it? I chose not to run the Swift Foot Boots like Zach was saying. Um so it's just kind of, if you're willing to take the risk, then you don't have to run as many of these cards. But in reality, to ensure that your game plan is intact when you need it, these are the cards you want to be running.
Yep. And some examples of utility cards are Regrowth. So Regrowth is 1 in green. It's a sorcery. It says return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So obviously this is an example of a graveyard recursion spell. This is great in that it's going to help you with resiliency, like I've talked about a couple of times throughout this episode. Is, say one of your combo pieces or something gets countered, this is going to help you get that back in your hand and be able to cast it again. Or just, you know, say you had a board wipe last turn, you don't really have anything, but you have an Avengers Zendikar or something like that in your graveyard. Cast Regrowth and play that Avenger again to kind of get your board state back up, get a lot more tokens onto your board. So this is going to help you with recovery and resiliency.
Yep. Another example we talked about is Swiftfoot Boots. And if you don't know what that does, it's 2 generic mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature has hexproof and haste, and it has an equip cost of 1 generic. So obviously, not only is your creature going to be able to hit faster if you need it to, it primarily, this card is run for the hexproof, I would say, because if your commander is getting removed, if you're like us, your deck is not heavily depending on your commander, but you're playing commander. You want your commander out. It's not gonna be as fun if your commander's dead all the time. So this allows them to stay on the battlefield more safely. They can do what they need to do without the risk of getting removed. And I think most decks should run Swiftfoot Boots, if not something like it, like a Mask of Abyssin or a Mirror Shield or a Curator's Ward or a Canopy Cover. Those are all different enchantment auras or artifacts that just give Shroud or Hexproof something so they can't be targeted by any removal or anything like that.
Yep. And the final example we're going to use here is Mausoleum Secrets. So this is 1 and a black for an instant and has Undergrowth, which says search your library for a black card with CMC less than or equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle your library. So this is an example of a tutor. Uh, this is one of the few kind of talked about earlier. You can kind of cast this uh, if
Liam
you say
Secrets,
had one of
good cheap tutor with a condition, which tutors are pretty hard to come by in budget. There's some, but they cost a lot in terms of CMC. So sometimes it hurts to run them. Sometimes you have to. Just kind of is what it is. But yeah, all these utility spells, I feel like hopefully we're getting the point across of what they are. They bring stuff back, they protect stuff, they help you get cards you need, they can get you out of bad situations, they can have your cover from board wipes. Um, all these different things are utility. Even like an abundance is a utility. It's a green enchantment. I think instead of drawing a card, you choose land or non-land, and you look at cards until you get whatever you chose. So if you're missing land, you say land, you can get one. If you say non-land because you have too many land, you can get a creature potentially. It's just these little things that help make your deck a little bit more efficient and more just it can survive basically.
Yeah, and like we said, a lot of these are gonna, the utility is probably the section where the line is kind of most blurred between these other deck components, like, regrowth. You could probably call that a value card in some uh, scenarios if you're playing more
Hmm.
of a graveyard-based deck. It really just depends. But these are just, like Christian said, these are cards that are gonna help you in certain scenarios and really help you to protect yourself and push your game plan. Protect your commander, things like that. Just make sure that you're not getting bullied off the board before you can really uh, play your game plan.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that fog effects are a great
Yeah, yeah,
utility. That's what I was talking about earlier. I mentioned, the guy casts an overwhelming stampede. He's going to try to finish off the game. Boom, you slam down a fog. And not only did you stop him from winning and make him waste his finisher, but you're alive because you paid, 2 mana for a prevent all combat damage this turn. So right there is a excellent example of how impactful a utility spell can be.
yep. So the final section that we're going to be jumping into here is land. Uh, so land, I think everybody knows that land is really critical in Commander. Obviously, your deck is just not going to work if you don't have the lands you need. You're not going to be able to cast your spells, and you're just going to have a bad time. So land is a little bit weird in budget just because it is extremely important to the game, like we were just talking about, but it doesn't actually help you win. Uh, so it can be very expensive in Commander, just because of how vital it is in every format, not just Commander. Your best lands, like your fetches and things like that, are just going to be obviously way out of budget range. So a lot of the time in our budget league, you're going to see a lot of basic lands. You're going to see guild gates and things like that that are, enter the battlefield tap. Let's say tap for two different colors, or tri lands that are just good in three color for color fixing and stuff like that. So that's typically what you're going to see. And a lot of times we're going to be running between 34 and 38 lands. That's going to differ just based on what kind of deck we're running, number of colors, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that pretty much sums that up. Again, Commander's a weird one. I'm sorry, not Commander. Land is a weird one. There's not a lot to say about it. Land is just land. It does what it does. Like Zach said with the tap ones, there's just land is already expensive. So wasting your budget trying to salvage it, as it were, is not really worth it. You kind of just take the hit and just run your guild gates and stuff like that. There's some utility lands that we'll give an example of, but generally you're going to be running your basics and your tap dual lands and tri lands and stuff like that. Um, there was something else I was going to say about it. Oh, and the thing is, you don't. If you were to waste some, I don't want to say waste, but spend some budget. Zach, you could correct me if you don't agree, but if you were to spend some budget getting these slightly better lands, like the check lands or the reveal lands or the lands from Battle of Zendikar that cost $2-ish, give or take, do you think a deck that's running those would be better than the decks in our format? Because I don't think they would be.
Yeah, I would say typically not. I mean, sure, you're probably gonna have better color fixing. So,
Hmm.
maybe if you're running three, four colors, that's something to consider possibly.
Hmm.
But personally, I would much rather spend that money in other places.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like they have the perfect mana out, right? But the stuff they're casting is just kind of bad.
Yeah.
Okay,
And like
yeah,
I said, this all has to tie together. So if I spend that money here, I'm gonna be making cuts somewhere else. And yeah.
exactly. And the lands, it's just lands are expensive, so it's a big, a big buy-in with these lands if you're going to try to put good land in. And I don't think it's worth it. If it's $3 for a shock, I'm not sorry, not $3 for a check land and $3 for an Ashnod's altar. I'm never picking that check land over Ashnod's altar.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like you're never going to, in budget, at least have the most, I don't know if consistent is the right word, but you're never going to have like a competitive uh you land. I don't know how to phrase this, but you're never going to have a competitive mana base like you would in CDH in budget.
Hmm.
You're always going to have majority basic lands, and then just your utility lands like we said, and things like the tri lands, the go gates. Even if I spend the extra money for the check lands, that's still the three or four more cards, but the majority of my lands are still going to be basics. So
Yeah, and that's another reason why ramp is really critical and good in budget because
mm,
you need to run it anyway. So you might as well use it to make up for the fact you're running so many basics or just these tap lands. And land tutoring is getting better. Circuitous route came out, I believe, in Ravnica Legions or War of the Spark or something. And you can use it to tutor up guild gates now. So your guild gates, though they are tapped, you can actually go fetch them. And that's really cool if you're running that card. And so, those type of things make up for the fact that you're running kind of, I don't want to say bad land, but weaker land, I guess.
mhm. Yeah, so some examples of cards that we run and that are good in budget are Evolving Wilds. And before I read it, there's another card, Terramorphic Expanse, that has the same effect. And these two cards go in, I think, every deck in our play group except for one has both of these cards in it.
Really? What do you know which one doesn't have them both?
Yeah, Kirkesh is all basic lands.
Oh my.
Yeah, I
Okay,
noticed
yeah,
that the other
that's
day when I
interesting.
was going through.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. So Evolving Wilds is so the land that says tap and sacrifice Evolving Wilds. Search your library for basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So obviously this is good in that you're going to have color fixing, like we said a few times. This is going to be able to get you any color basic lane card you want, put it onto the battlefield. It is going to be tapped, so you're not ramping per se. You're just sacrificing this land that doesn't do anything by itself for a basic land that's going to, obviously help you cast things that you need to cast.
Right, exactly. Um, Another example is Command Tower, the classic commander card made just for it. Uh, Tap, add 1 mana of any combination or any color in your commander's color identity. So obviously this card only works in Commander, and that's one of the reasons why it's not super expensive. But in Commander, it's an excellent card because it basically taps for any color you could ever need. Um, for no cost. So it's just a really powerful card. I know for a while there it wasn't budget, which is weird to say, but it wasn't. It was kind of at the $2-ish mark, maybe $1.50. So you could do it. But now I last time I checked, and that's why I included it in our examples, it's about 40 cents. So it's right on the average spot. So this is one of those cards that's definitely worth running.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that isn't Mana Confluence, is that the one that has the same effect except it doesn't say commander, just taps for any color?
Yeah, it just taps for any color and it does a damage to you, I think.
Yeah, and I think that one's significantly more expensive than Command Tower because it's playable in any format.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah. Yeah, so the last example we have here is Emergent Zone. Obviously land, so it has two abilities. First one is you can tap it to add a colorless mana. The second one is you can pay one generic, tap it, and sacrifice Emergent Zone, and you may cast spells this turn as though they had flash. So this is a great example of utility land. Obviously, with the first ability, you're going to be able to get mana from it whenever you want. So it's still going to be useful even if you don't want to use that second ability where it has flash. But then, say you want to flash in a blocker or something like that, or some ETB creature that's going to give you some value when you really need it, and it's not your turn. You can pay this mana, sacrifice it, and just be able to have that little bit of added utility when you need it.
Right, exactly. It's just it in the card is like 30 cents, right? So it just you just throw it in there. It doesn't hurt. If you really are starving for budget somewhere, you don't have to run it, but I run this in every single deck I have just because if there's ever a moment where I might need to cast something on someone else's turn, I can do it. So it's just good. It's just good to have around. There's some cards, like Zach said, Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse are in every single deck except for one. And I think that speaks volumes of the card because we have 37 decks in our budget play group. And I think that speaks volumes for just this budget format produces its own staples. Our Evolving Wild Summer Expanse probably are in most. Well, I don't know if they actually are in most competitive decks. I think they're most normal decks, budgetless, but not necessarily cutthroat CEDH level. But they're just good, right? They don't cost much. They do what they need to do for you, and they thin the deck. I you know I run them every time, and I will continue to run both all the time.
Yep.
Well, I think that pretty much wraps up um, every category that we believe is kind of standard in a budget uh, deck, and how many cards of each, where the budget should go, how they work, why they work. I think that about covers everything, Zach. Is there anything else you want to say about any of these categories or overall or anything like that?
And so, just to kind of wrap everything together here, I think it's important to realize that even though we kind of broke this down into different sections and things like that, this is going to change based on your deck, right? Like,
That's very important to remember.
if you're running a commander, say you're running a Phoenix deck, that's going to be completely different than any other deck, just because it is like a very unique ability and kind of an under-supported archetype in Mill. So that might significantly change the number of different things you're running. Like, it's going to have a similar number of lands, but you might be running less draw or something like that. It's important to kind of play into your game plan, even if it doesn't match up with this more kind of generic breakdown of what should be in your deck. But we do think that generally speaking, this is a good guideline to kind of follow as far as how many of each of these you're going to be putting in, and it's always good to kind of go through and consider, even if I have these finishers, how many draw spells do I need to put in here to get to these? How much utility do I need to make sure that I can keep playing in my game plan? And you know, do I need to run protection for my commander, or is the deck still going to function without it? There's just a lot of different kind of decisions that you're going to have to make when you're assembling a deck, and we think that this is a good framework to keep in mind when you're doing that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It really is a framework. You don't need to when you're producing a deck in our format. I mean, this is a good baseline, I think, for any commander deck. But you don't need to come to this video and be like, okay, I got all 12 removal spells in there. I'm good. It's not like that. And like Zach said, it's really dependent on the commander, but also it's really important on the color because for me in my green decks, I typically run that 34 land because I know I have so many ramp spells. But in my blue white deck that doesn't have as much ramp, I'm running 38. So yeah, it's just the commander matters, color matters for all these categories. It's just something to keep in mind when producing. Your archetype matters. it's something to keep in mind when building and developing whatever deck you're working on. So I think that pretty much sums up everything we wanted to cover on this second part of the analysis of a budget environment. If you enjoyed the video, like it. If you want to see more of what we got coming up, the final episode of the series is coming soon. Go ahead and subscribe. If you want to be notified or see more when videos are coming out, you can follow us on Twitter or join our Discord. The links are in the description below. Again, we thank you all for listening. We're really excited to wrap up this mini series on the next episode, and then from there jump into deck techs. We'll have our D&D Adventures in Forgotten Realms set review coming up soon when that releases physically. Beyond that, I think that wraps up the episode. Anything else you want to add, Zach?
Oh, no, I think that wraps it up. Thanks for tuning in.
Yep, thanks everybody. We'll see you next time.